Hello, it's me, your local non-binary witch, and I'm back after a bit of a hiatus. Did you miss me? And today I'd like to talk about reclaiming pagan words and concepts, in particular, the concept of virtue. Now, when people think of virtue, they probably think of some po-faced nonsense like obedience or chastity or some other thing. But I'm here to tell you that virtue is a pagan concept. The discourse of virtue ethics was first invented in pagan times, and it started with Socrates and moved on to Aristotle and the Stoics. And the term virtue is from Latin, and the root word vir, a man. So obviously the sort of like manliness comes into it as well, but like setting that aside, the kind of virtues that I'm talking about are the ones that would characterize a pagan household or a pagan person. So hospitality, honour, fortitude, and the four classical virtues which were in balance with each other. Wisdom is another virtue that we might think of that's useful. So both ancient and modern virtue ethics talk about the cultivation of virtues in order to lead to eudaimonia, which literally means blessedness or harmony or human flourishing, it's often translated as. So virtue is a useful concept, and it is in fact a pagan concept. Both the heathens and the Religio Romana practitioners have lists of virtues. There's the 9 noble virtues of heathenry, and there's the very long list of Roman virtues that are on the various Religio Romana websites. So virtue is very definitely a pagan and polytheist concept. And I've been writing about the 8 Wiccan virtues for some years now in my books, All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca, and the Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation. So the cultivation of virtue is part of the inner work. And it's interesting that we talk about the virtues of a herb as the properties of a herb, or that which makes it efficacious. So a virtue is something that can also be translated as efficacy, effectiveness, right? And we also talk about the virtues of a metal in alchemy. So it's also a magical concept. And the interesting thing about virtue ethics is that they're not a series of thou shalt nots. They are, if you like, a series of thou shalts. So it's a positive ethic rather than a negative one. Now, the Wiccan Rede is all very well and very useful, but all the Wiccan Rede tells us to do is, "And it harm none, do what thou wilt." So which is more usefully turned round as "do what thou wilt, and it harm none," which just means in effect, think about what you're going to do before you do it, which is useful, but it doesn't tell us what qualities we should be cultivating in ourselves in order to get to a state of human flourishing. So one virtue that everybody could do with right now, of course, is living in harmony with the earth. So it's interesting that 2 of the virtues that are mentioned in the Charge of the Goddess are honour and humility. And humility literally means close to the earth. And if you put honour and humility together, then they make integrity, which is a good virtue. A couple of other traditional pagan virtues are reciprocity and hospitality, also very important. So we can see that, virtue has been a pagan concept longer than it was ever a Christian concept. And in fact, it can be seen as a secular concept if that's your bag. It doesn't have to be all po-faced, and you know, some of the things that are listed as virtues in Christianity I don't consider to be a virtue. Like obedience isn't a virtue. It is, you know, if somebody gives you an order to do something that your conscience disagrees with, then obeying that order isn't a virtue. You know, in the 19th century, somebody wrote the dreadful poem "The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck," which was about a boy who was on a boat that was burning, and he ended up dying because he was obeying the order to stay on deck given to him by his parents. So I think this is a very good illustration of the idea that obedience is not a virtue. But that aside, you know, that's an example of an anti-virtue, if you like. But and it's also a really great illustration of like why we need to reclaim the concept of virtue from people who have co-opted it for nefarious purposes like that. And anyways, pagan virtues, yes, right. Honour, yes, definitely. You know, living with integrity, being as good as your word. If I give my word, then I will do the thing that I said I was going to do. Humility, right? Being humble and knowing when to stop, that kind of stuff, and not being overweening and but then, you know, those two are really good in honour and humility are good as a pair because they create a balance between the two. Strength is a virtue, grace is a virtue, and what are the other ones? Power and compassion, mirth and reverence, those are good. The heathens have an interesting one which is called frith, the idea that when a group of people come together, that they do so peacefully, which is, you know, great for stopping actual fistfights from breaking out. But on the other hand, can be awkward when you actually want to challenge somebody's obnoxious views and somebody goes, oh no, you can't do that because frith. And quite a lot of heathens have rightly pushed back against that interpretation of the term frith. And interestingly, there's a similar thing in circles where perfect love and perfect trust is a watchword, because people use that to suppress dissent as well. You know, if there's something that needs saying because you need to say it, then truth is also a virtue. Honesty, you know, like sticking to your principles is a virtue. So I think we can see that the concept of virtue is a useful concept and one that we should be reclaiming. So let's do it. Have a nice day. Blessed be.